All right, welcome back to Lessons from the Prophet Jonah. I apologize that I have to do another makeup video. The video ended up being very choppy from lesson 5. So rather than post that and make you suffer through a choppy video with choppy audio, I thought it'd just be better to make a new video. So this is lesson 5 of our series, which is called Intrigue and Relevance of the Great Fish. So in this lesson we'll be talking all about the fish from Jonah chapter 1 verse 17 and then chapter 2 verse 10, where we read, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights." So the question that, frankly, I find many commentators overlook or perhaps marginalize is the question, what exactly is this great fish? Okay? And again, does it matter? Does it matter what it is? That's largely what we're going to be looking at today. What is this great fish, or in Hebrew, it's Dag Gadol. And we're going to start by looking at 3 different theories as to what this creature might have been. Theory number 1, the whale theory. This is probably the most popular opinion that you'll hear out there, is that Jonah got swallowed by some biological creature that we could classify today, such as a whale. In Hebrew, the word used for fish is dog, and I think that's a little bit humorous that the Hebrew word for fish is dog. But then, how is this word used in the rest of the Bible? Well, in Hebrew, this word is really a very generic word that describes simply an inhabitant of the water. Okay, so this could be a fish, this could be a dolphin. We could even lump in things like crabs, octopi, sharks, etc. Okay, and it's used mainly in the Hebrew to contrast with other animal kingdoms. Okay, and what I mean is that you have the animal kingdom of the birds and the beasts and the bugs and also the fish, right? So if you look at 1 Kings chapter 4 in verse 33, this is talking about Solomon and his great wisdom. In verse 32 it says, "He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And here in verse 33, "He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts, and of birds, and of reptiles, and of fish." So here you have 4 different categories of biological creatures: beasts, birds, reptiles, and fish. You'll see this elsewhere where reptiles is substituted by creeping things. We see this in Ezekiel chapter 38 and verse 20, talking about the day of the Lord here. It says, "The fish of the sea," that's the word dog, "and the birds of the heavens, and the beasts of the field, and all creeping things that creep on the earth, and all the people who are on the face of the earth shall quake at my presence. So here you have these four categories: fish of the sea, birds of the heavens, beasts of the field, and all creeping things. And then it adds in all people as a fifth category. We read the same thing in the book of Zephaniah, chapter 1. In verse 3, it says, I will sweep away man and beast. I will sweep away the birds of the heavens and the fish of the sea. So this is largely how the word is used in Scripture as a descriptor of fish or water inhabitants. Okay? So that doesn't really tell us much. You know, this could be a blue whale, or this could be a little sunfish, right? Or even a starfish, something as obscure as that. Now, the funny thing here in Jonah is that we actually get a descriptor paired with this fish. It's not just a dog, as it is elsewhere in Scripture, but here it is a dog gadol, a great fish. This is the only place in the Hebrew Bible where this word dog is qualified in some way. So if we take it as a great fish, as a big fish, then we're probably thinking something more like a sperm whale or a whale shark. Okay, both of these creatures, sperm whales and whale sharks, have been known to swallow objects larger than man. So it's very conceivable that man could have been swallowed by one of these creatures. Some have mentioned that whale sharks are the largest fish. Okay, if you are thinking of whales as being mammals, whale sharks are the largest actual fish. Now, I don't think that really holds much stock for the biblical writer, because in their mind, they didn't know that whales were mammals. Whales inhabited the sea. Okay, they were fish. They were dog. So it wouldn't have made much difference to the ancient Hebrew. So I don't think that we can rule out whales just because they are mammals. But that's theory one. Here's a picture of a sperm whale. You can see how large it is compared to the human there on the left. There is a whale shark, the largest fish in the ocean. So there's theory one. If that's the one you want to go with, then those are some really good candidates for your fish. Theory number two is that the fish is not a fish at all, but is merely a metaphor for Babylon. I call this the Babylon metaphor theory. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I thought I'd throw it out there because this is legitimately something that scholars think of, and specifically those scholars who like to view the book of Jonah as a complete allegory. So if the book of Jonah is truly an allegory and nothing more, then Jonah represents the nation of Israel, and your fish then is going to represent Babylon, who swallows up Israel in the exile, and then spews Israel back out, if you will, later on. Now, it sounds kind of neat, but if you really think about it, first of all, Babylon wasn't a threat during the time of Jonah. Assyria was really the big world power, and Assyria is the one who swallowed up the northern tribes of Israel where Jonah was from anyway. So it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to make this correlation. Secondly, the time period really doesn't match up. I mean, they were in exile in Babylon for 70 years, the nation of Israel, and that doesn't correlate at all with the 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the fish. And despite that, or despite all that, the book of Jonah really doesn't conform well to your typical allegory of this time period. Its literary style is narrative. It's not allegory. Even though there is a lot of symbolism and a lot of irony and other literary devices in the book, it's just not written as an allegory. So overall, I find this theory the least convincing of all the theories. But if that's the one that you prefer to go with, then here is your fish, the Babylonian Empire. Theory number 3. I call this the chaos monster theory. Or, if you will, the Leviathan theory. And right now you're probably thinking, well, where are you getting this from? Well, it's funny because scholars have noticed something in early Christian art on the book of Jonah. So in early Christian art, when they depict the story of Jonah, they like to draw the fish, the Dag Gadol, the great fish, as a sea monster. Okay? Here's one example. You have Jonah there being thrown overboard from the ship. And here's your whale. That doesn't really look much like a whale to me. It resembles more of a dog or something like that. Here's a clearer example. You see to the left Jonah getting thrown out of the boat. Now this is kind of a panoramic view of the entire story. So to the left you see Jonah getting thrown overboard and swallowed up by the whale. It looks more like a twisting snake or a sea serpent of some sort. And then you see that same critter disgorging Jonah over there to the right. Here is a marble statue of depicting Jonah. Kind of a strange looking whale, if you ask me. So you get this all over in Christian art, where what should be a whale actually looks more like a sea serpent or sea monster. And so scholars have wondered, where does this come from? Where are these early Christians getting this idea? Well, this is going to come from the Greek version of the Old Testament. So at one point in time, a bunch of Jewish scholars translated their Hebrew scriptures into Greek, because Greek was the common language of the day. And there were, I believe, 70 different scholars that made this translation of Hebrew into Greek, and they called it the Septuagint, after those 70 scholars. And as with any translation, when you're going through, you have to make certain interpretive decisions. And so the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, doesn't always look 100% like the Hebrew version. Okay, there has been some translation done. And in this Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Hebrew term dag gadol in the Jonah story, these two words, which mean great fish, is translated as katos in Greek. And so you are probably asking, well, what does katos mean? Katos is equivalent to a Hebrew word tanin. And katos and tanin are translated in English with words such as sea monster, dragon, or leviathan. Sea monster, dragon, or leviathan. We see this in Job chapter 3 verse 8, Job 41:1, Psalm 74:14, Psalm 104:26, Isaiah 27:1. Those are all references to leviathan. And then tanin, or sea serpent, dragon, we see that in Genesis 1:21, Exodus 7:9-12, Deuteronomy 32:33, Nehemiah 2:13, Job 7:12, Job 30:29, Psalm 44:19, Psalm 74:13. The list could go on and on. We have references in Isaiah, a bunch of them, a couple in Jeremiah, and even in Ezekiel and the prophet Micah. So when the Greek translators get to this dag gadol, they're thinking, we should put katos here, okay? This word that means sea monster, or dragon, or leviathan. But why is this? Why would they do this when the Hebrew word used is just merely dog or fish? It's just a basic generic word. Granted, it is qualified. It's a great fish. But still, why does that bring to mind sea monster? What about the Jonah story made the translators think Leviathan? Well, to understand this, first we need to understand who or what exactly is Leviathan. Now this is a topic that has received multiple different interpretations. The most famous description of Leviathan in the Bible is in Job chapter 41, where God is speaking, and in the course of God's discourse, he mentions a bunch of different critters, and at the end he mentions Behemoth and Leviathan. And a common interpretation that originated in the 1600s was that Behemoth was a hippopotamus and Leviathan was a crocodile. Probably because these are the two biological creatures that we know of today that match the descriptions the best. Although, if we were to go and to look at the description of Leviathan in Job 41, we would see that this is much more than a crocodile. There's a lot of descriptors here that really don't fit crocodile at all. So more modernly, we've heard Leviathan interpreted as a dinosaur. Now this theory is promoted largely by your creation scientist organizations such as Answers in Genesis. And they'll tell you that Leviathan was a dinosaur, something like a Kronosaurus or a plesiosaur. And I'd say that they're getting warmer. You know, it's going to match the description we find in Job just a little bit better than would a crocodile. However, if we were to put on our ancient Israelite goggles, if we were to look through the lens of the ancient Israelite to see how they interpreted Leviathan, we would see something entirely different. We would see that Leviathan is not necessarily a biological creature, but is instead a supernatural sea monster, symbolic of chaos. Now, we may have a difficult time wrapping our mind around this idea, but I'll explain. First of all, here's your theory number one, your crocodile. Here is your dinosaur theory. This is going to be a Chronosaurus skeleton, I believe. And here is a video that will hopefully help to explain the supernatural chaos monster theory. Alright, so I hope you can see that when the Greek translators are translating Dag Gadol into Katos, this is what they have in their mind when they're thinking Katos. Okay? They're not thinking a dinosaur. They're thinking this sea serpent who's symbolic of chaos and destruction. Okay? And as we saw in the video, the idea of chaos and sea monsters goes all the way back to the creation account. And this even helps us to understand the book of Job. I mean, that's another lesson in and of itself, but we see how Job is surrounded by chaos and destruction through the entire series of events in the book of Job. And then we see how God, in his response to Job, ultimately ends up telling him, it is I who is in control of the powers of chaos, these chaos monsters. I am the one who can defeat them. And that's what gives Job hope. So we'll see this all over in the Bible. But then here in Jonah, what is making these translators think sea monster? What about the text makes them see that? Sorry, here's a slide talking about the information that was in the video. So evidence for chaos monster thinking. First of all, we see that in the Hebrew, it's more clear. It hides itself in English. But in Jonah chapter 1, verse 4, where it says, the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea. This is better translated in the sea, not on the sea. Think of a tempest, think of churning waters in the sea. We see this associated with Leviathan in passages such as Psalm 104:26, or Job 26:12-13, or Job 41:31. When we see Leviathan talked about, we see that the waters are churning. There's a tempest in the sea. Secondly, imagery of death and the deep. Now this is seen mostly in Jonah's prayer. But as we'll look next week, Jonah says, out of the belly of Sheol I cried. He says, for you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and billows passed over me. This is classic poetic death language. And death was very closely tied with chaos and the sea and this monster, Leviathan, this chaos monster. And even in verse 3 of chapter 2, we see where it says, the floods surrounded me. This word floods is the Hebrew word nahar. And nahar we find in another Canaanite language, Ugaritic. And in this other language, that's very closely tied to Hebrew, this word nahar is actually the name of Leviathan. Their Leviathan is named Nahar, okay, which the Hebrew uses here for the word floods. And then this word surrounded me, when it says the floods surrounded me, we can find this word elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures. It's the word sabab. We find this in Isaiah chapter 27, verse 1, where it says, in that day the Lord with his hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. So here is a passage talking about Leviathan, and it uses this word sabab, which gets translated in Jonah as surrounds, but which gets translated in Isaiah as twisting. Leviathan, the twisting serpent. This word has the idea of a coiling snake. Think of a snake coiling around a tree branch, or perhaps their prey. Or a sea serpent twisting around a ship. Okay? This is what the word sabab means. And so this word is associated with Leviathan elsewhere. Here in Jonah, where it says, and the floods surrounded me. If we take this word floods, nahar, and we associate it with the name of Leviathan from this sister language, Ugaritic, this phrase could literally say, and Leviathan was twisting around me. Okay? So there are a lot of poetic inferences here where we see this Leviathan imagery. We see this imagery brought forth, which would clearly associate in the minds of these translators that we have more than just a great fish going on here. We have a chaos monster, a sea serpent. And Jesus himself confirms this when he quotes from the Septuagint in the Gospel of Matthew. He refers back to the Jonah story. He says, as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the katos. Jesus uses the word katos. Now some translations of the Bible will insert the word whale there, but never is katos ever used of a whale. Katos is always used in the Greek of a sea monster, or a dragon, or a leviathan, if you will. It always has this idea of chaos and death. So in summary, I asked my class, what do you think the great fish was? After reviewing these 3 theories, do you think it was a whale or a whale shark? Do you think this was a metaphor for the nation of Babylon? Or perhaps you think that due to all this poetic imagery and due to the translations into Greek, that perhaps there was more going on here than just a biological creature. Well, we would be remiss to discard the imagery and vocabulary that is used here and is elsewhere tied to the description of Leviathan, the chaos sea monster. This sort of imagery certainly permeates the story. Okay, so we have to acknowledge that, whatever we think this thing may be. Now, whether sea serpents literally existed, or whether this was a whale, or even perhaps if this was a dinosaur, like a Kronosaurus, the symbology still applies. And it will become incredibly important when Jonah is cited in the New Testament. Okay, I think we would also be remiss to say that this fish is nothing but a metaphor. Okay, we see that the fish swallowed Jonah. Jonah was in its belly. And we see later in the story that the fish vomits Jonah out on dry land. In my opinion, it's pretty difficult for a metaphor to vomit something, to spew something out. So this seems to be a literal creature, okay? And I don't think we can know for sure if this was indeed a whale, or perhaps if it was a dinosaur, or maybe it was a sea serpent, something that either used to exist, or something that perhaps God conjured up specifically for that moment in time. Regardless, it has symbology attached to it, symbology of death and the grave. This is going to become very important when Jesus cites Jonah later. We've already hinted at that. But the fact that this fish is associated with death and chaos becomes very, very important. And we'll look more at some of that death imagery in our next lesson when we talk about Jonah's prayer. But for now, just keep in mind that this was a literal creature, okay? And we can't say for sure what it was, but regardless, it had some very clear symbology associated with it. Symbology of death and chaos. And as a takeaway to this lesson, I just think we need to be reminded that sometimes our modern and scientific mindset needs to be challenged and informed by the ancient Near East worldview. I focused a lot on viewing the book of Jonah through the eyes of the ancient Israelite. And when you view it in that way, then you're going to see past some of our scientific presuppositions. And you're going to notice the symbolism and metaphor that's being employed in this narrative, right? I mean, if you were to ask the ancient Hebrew, well, what biological creature was the fish that swallowed Jonah? He would probably look at you and say, who cares what it was? Look at what it means. Okay? And that's what I want you to understand, that this means something. It doesn't necessarily matter what it was, although it is fun to speculate. I personally like the idea that this could have been an actual sea serpent, or even the idea that it may have been a dinosaur. That's appealing to me. But I also have no problem with the idea that this could have merely been a whale or a whale shark. Okay? I'm fine with all three of those ideas, because there's meaning associated with this monster, this great fish, that becomes utterly important to the story. And that's really what the great fish is all about. Thank you for watching this, and I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson where we talk about Jonah's prayer.